Most enterprises don't have an AI problem, they have a data confidence problem. Confidence in the accuracy of the data, the security of the data, the governance of the data, and the actionability of the data. And here's the number that should stop every data leader cold. 84% of enterprise AI projects are failing before they even start, not because of their model, not because of their GPU, not because of the budget, but because the data isn't understood, governed, or trusted. Over the last 30 years, we've seen digital data grow across three phases: data storage, data set management, and data intelligence. And one of the men who's been closer to that arc than almost anyone in the industry is my illustrious guest today, CEO of Everpure, formerly Pure Storage, Charlie Giancarlo. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Sean. Look forward to having this interview with you.
So let's jump into the headline, Charlie. Here at Beyond the IT Headlines, we break down what's making news. And today, it's our news. On February 23rd, Pure Storage, a company that built its reputation on being the best storage company on the planet, dropped storage from its moniker and announced that it is now Everpure. With that announcement also came the intent to acquire OneTouch.io, a company that does something most storage vendors have never touched: giving data context, intelligence, and meaning. So, Charlie, let's start with the new name, Everpure. Analysts got it right. This isn't a reinvention, it's a disciplined expansion. Walk us through what this means and the naming logic. What does Ever and Pure each carry to this new identity?
Well, first of all, we wanted to indicate to the market and to especially to our customers and employees, that we are still pure. We've always referred to ourselves as pure, and we think that fits the way we operate and the way we conduct business very well. And we're not moving away from that in any way. Ever harkens to one of our, major promises that we make to our customers, which is evergreen. That is, our products are always modern, they're always new, even ones they bought a decade ago. If you visit those installations, you'd see a product that was basically something that looks exactly like something we sold in the last year or so. So it harkens back to our evergreen program. But I think more importantly is that what we're saying is we're not changing from what we were. We are adding, or rather, we are maturing. So you said we're dropping storage. We're actually not dropping storage. Storage is something that we're going to continue to invest in very heavily. But we've grown to a size now where we can take on ever greater challenges that our customers have, namely not taking our customers' focus and attention away from having to manage storage and giving them the ability to actually manage their data. And I know we're going to talk more about this, but we're expanding what we're doing beyond just storage. And that's why the name change was appropriate. The OneTouch acquisition was also a great example of some of the direction that we're going.
So, Charlie, let's kind of set the context for our audience here. So, we talked about three eras of storage, right? I mean, you and I have both been in this business for quite a while. We've seen data storage evolve to data set management and now to data intelligence. So, I guess let's start at data storage. I mean, if storage is era one, what have you seen in that space? I mean, how mature and how predictable is that particular era, and how critical is it moving forward?
Well, I think one of the things, well, first of all, data storage is almost everything. I mean, it's the foundation. If you don't get it right, if it's not secure, if it's not reliable, if it is not consistent, you can't do anything else, right? It's sort of like any other infrastructure. The base portion of the infrastructure doesn't work. All the great things that you can build on top of it. Just think about how dependent we are on the electricity grid, or on energy availability in general. If we're energy insecure, all the things you get out of energy are just not possible. So, what we've done at Pure is not only made storage just more reliable. What we've done is we've taken away all the hard work of making it work for the customer. And now what we're enabling the customer to do is move away from having to fiddle with the knobs and the dials and the tuning of storage systems and the manual configuration of the storage system. So allowing them to just define what they want from their data. So in a great example of this, if I could use an analogy, imagine having a fairly large home in the 1800s, you had fireplaces in every room, and you'd have to make sure that, you had the right amount of wood, the right amount of air going into each one of those fireplaces. You'd have to make sure that you were filling the wood in each of the rooms. And would you have fine grain control of the temperature in the room? Probably not. You'd probably be having to manage between, 20-degree swings, in that room as you're dealing with all those things. That is kind of like a good analogy for most enterprise storage today. They're fiddling with every single array. What do we do today? We have a thermostat. We set the thermostat. Sometimes we have a thermostat that allows us different temperatures during the day. We set that once, maybe every couple of years. Right? We set it once every couple of years, and the temperature is automatically maintained. And that's what we're doing with Pure. Is we're allowing customers to manage their data rather than having to manage their storage.
Yeah, so you're touching on a really interesting point here, right? Which is, I think the original foundational point of storage was to have durable data, that data that would be durable, that would be there, that would be available. But now what you're saying is that, okay, my rooms are heated in your analogy, but now I actually have to get to usable data, right? So ultimately, how would you define that durable data and usable data? And why is this such a big kind of major step for organizations in terms of thinking about their data assets and their data estate?
Well, if data at one time was largely, transaction database, a sales database, and you would both transact on that database, but you would also bill off that database. So data was in one spot. It served a very similar purpose for everything. But as we now know, in today's world, any solution environment requires lots of different systems working together, right? And in order to be able to do that, all of these systems, all the systems need to be working all the time. And the data relates a data in one database and a data in another unstructured environment need to be able to work together. That's a complex equation, and companies spend. I know this because every company, including ours, has systems. It has to go into multiple systems in order to close a transaction, or to be able to do a renewal, or to be able to solve a customer problem. And now you are in this very complex environment where all the data is not in one place; it's in multiple places. And so, to make data actionable, there's a lot of work that typically goes on today. Some of it can be ad hoc, manual labor. Others is what's called, ETL chains to make the data more usable. And we can go into a lot more detail in this. But at the end of the day, you've got to, all of the data in the enterprise now has to be accessible. You have to know that it's available. Increasingly, companies want the ability to have rules that allow those different data pools to be integrated in a way that produces results. And that's something that is, I'd say, new over the last decade or so.
Yeah, so you're really talking about an operating model shift here, right? It's no longer about
That's right.
storing it. It's about actually building an operating model that allows data to be governed and data to be essentially, whether it's trimmed, you talked about ETL, extract, transform, load. How do we integrate it into our day-to-day activities? Um, Tell us a little bit about the market. You talk to so many customers in our marketplace. Where is this kind of data operating model really breaking today? And where is this causing issues, not just for data practitioners, but for executives and even boards?
Yeah, I would claim in two areas. One is in the area of data security, and which also impinges a little bit on the cost of storing the data. But the second one is in the area of having data availability for things such as AI and analytics. And I put AI and analytics in somewhat the same container because the challenges are similar for both. So let's start with cyber threats and also with cost. So today, the average data set, that is a set of data used for a particular purpose. Let's take a database, or let's take an email repository, or let's just take a customer database, for example, um, is typically replicated on the order of 8 times, meaning there are 8 copies of that data somewhere in the organization. Because companies are managing storage array by storage array, they're not really keeping records of where that data exists. So where the data exists is somewhat unknown in many cases to customers. Because part of it is that any person inside the organization with a credential can copy it for their own purpose and place it somewhere else. And that tracking is largely lost. Now, that individual might have left the company, might have moved to a different job. Their login hasn't changed. The typical way hackers get into companies now is they log in, they don't hack in, meaning credentials get lost and don't get rotated or updated. And now all of a sudden, a copy of a critical data is now accessible to the outside. So that's your cyber risk. So you have two things there. One is you have more copies than you need. And two is you have copies in places that you don't even know about. So without good, what we call data set governance, you have no lifecycle record of your data, and it puts it at risk. What we're doing with capability we call Fusion, and with the fact that customers can create this enterprise data cloud, is we allow customers to keep a database of all of their copies of data where it is, and set policies by which the data is placed and tracked as it goes through its life cycle. And so that's data set management. It helps in the cyber security area, and it helps as well to make sure that customers are not don't have more copies of their data than they absolutely need.
Yeah, so it sounds like moving from a human element of people having to watch over all this and check on all this to having a programmatic operating model that says that Fusion and the enterprise data cloud will ultimately govern the data through its life cycle and protect you from having human error and human exposure to what you just described in cyber.
Right. Again, the analogy goes to having lots of people feed different fires in different rooms versus just setting the thermostat and having the control system take care of it. Now, the second thing that you asked about, which is, okay, what about data for AI and analytics? Well, let's go back to the fact that you have individual arrays that typically have been designed, or most of our customers have systems of operations, okay, operational systems. That is the transaction database, the customer database, the employee database, the email system, and so forth. These are systems that were designed to solve a specific problem or opportunity, right? The data that was defined in those systems was defined specifically for that opportunity. It is a bit of a misnomer when people talk about AI using data. Actually, AI is not very good at raw data because that raw data doesn't have context. For example, 20% is a piece of raw data. What does it mean? 20% of what? You know, Even if you knew it was a 20% of revenue, well, okay, 20% of revenue is what? And is it high or is it low? So when AI goes through training models, AI clouds go through training models, they spend a lot of time in defining the data that goes into the training model before they actually do training. Because the data is not data, it's got to be information. Let's call data with context, meaning that you know what it is. Let's call that information rather than data. AI needs information. Raw data is not information. It requires context. Where we're going, what One Touch is helping us with, what a lot of our internal development now is focused on, is adding that context to the data as the data is being created in the systems of operations, in the operational systems. That will then start to replace and just make it a lot easier and more straightforward for companies to be able to use their operational systems to feed into AI and analytics. Because if you were to speak to the customers that are the most advanced in their planning around AI, they will tell you that their biggest problem is that their data is not ready for AI. And AI doesn't solve that problem. AI expects information, not data. And to turn that information data to turn that data into information takes weeks, if not months, a lot of tooling and a lot of people. And that's the opportunity that we see is going to be really critical for our to help solve for our customers.
So Charlie, this is really interesting. So we've traditionally looked at context a completely different way, and I just want to dive very quickly into this. We've looked at metadata, right? So if I think of a traditional file share, what was the date it was created? What was the date it was last accessed? Date it was last changed? Who was the user who last accessed it? It sounds like when you're talking about data intelligence and context, you're really stretching to, I want to understand the sensitivity of what's inside the data, the lineage of where it came from, the relationships it has with other data, the access posture, who's allowed to see it. This feels like a completely new definition of context. And it feels like most of us don't have the metadata engine in place today to really tell us any of that about our data.
That's right. There's storage context, there's access context, there is application context, certainly all of that, right? And that's been somewhat part of this storage story. The context that's not there is, what is the exact meaning of the data that's in this database? How does the data in this database, uh, first of all, what are the rows, what are the columns, what do they mean? But then, how does it relate to other data that's in other databases, right? How does it relate to information that is unstructured, such as you have information in unstructured databases or unstructured data repositories about customers? Well, how does that relate to the data that's in the database? So in the customer database. So, adding more and more context to information as it's being recorded, for example, as a transaction database, you know, uh, allows that information to be more easily utilized by AI agents, et cetera.
So would it be fair for me to say, Charlie, then that ultimately, if the enterprise data cloud is where data resides and where how data sets are managed and governed in a programmatic way, then OneTouch now becomes the context engine that bolts onto this and really provides a whole new era of data intelligence?
That's correct. What we will do with One Touch and also organic development is allow the information that's across what we're calling the enterprise data cloud to be correlated, to understand how it is typically used in the enterprise context, right? And to be able to add that as context to the originating data, in the operational data stores.
Okay, so let's round this out, right? We can't end any kind of call in this day and age without bringing AI into the discussion. So let's just dig into this AI being the accelerant around all of this. You and I have talked about this a little bit in the past. I know what you actually believe here, but how does AI fit in? I mean, would we be here in the same problem with the same issues if the AI craze hadn't begun? Or is AI really making us move at a much faster speed than we would otherwise? And this now becomes one of the biggest priorities, that being getting to AI ready data.
Well, I believe we would be in the same place with or without AI because customers creating the capability to create accurate systems of record has been a IT bugaboo and challenge, from the very beginning. And getting to true systems of record is a is a nirvana for every enterprise, right? And a constant struggle and challenge. That being said, there's no doubt that AI is accelerating the interest in getting to this next location just much, much higher. So I don't think we would be as nearly as far along or have the level of interest we're currently getting out of organizations without the promise that AI can significantly improve both to improve productivity and potentially even revenues, in most organizations.
Okay, so look, we've talked a lot about technology. We've talked about data storage, data set management, data intelligence. We've talked about context engines. Um, as you talk to your peers at the executive level, what would you say around people and process? What really has to change organizationally for customers and enterprises to capture the value here? We know the tooling isn't the hard part; it's the people and process. And kind of what does that conversation look like?
Well, I think there is a standard, and I would call it right now traditional way of creating an AI or analytics infrastructure. And my our opinion now, that's old school, and that structure that exists today is use the operational systems for what they're good for, which is operational systems. Create a whole new set of systems that are focused on, let's call it information intelligence. Okay, copy the data and transform it in the other systems, in the systems of intelligence. And these are two entirely separate worlds. And what we believe is these worlds need to come together, and that means that we need to have the data scientists and the chief data officer and the people that manage operations to come together, because we can save, not only can we save a lot of money, but frankly, it's the only way to start working on real time information rather than information that has taken weeks or months to curate, into information. So one of the things that needs to be different is we need to start getting the data people and the operational infrastructure people in IT working together and talking together about a new architecture that really leverages operational systems.
Yeah, I like what you just said. I mean, it reminds me a lot of breaking down the silos, right? My job is to only store the data. My job is to only move the data. My job is to only use the data. It sounds like we have to all get aligned on what is the outcome here. The outcome is to get maximum value and leverage out of the data that we are collecting and essentially gathering as a business. And nobody should feel their job is done until we've reached that end goal. And that is a
That's
hard
exactly right.
transformational problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
Charlie, last question. I I I want last question. I want the version you'd give me if you had 60 seconds with every CIO, CDO, and CISO on the planet. What's the number one question that most data leaders aren't asking themselves? What do you think is the biggest blind spot right now that it's staring us in the face, but we're just not acknowledging it or acting on it fast enough?
I would say the biggest blind spot it is, in fact, that they are using yesterday's overall architecture for tomorrow's problem, which is this complete separation between systems of operation and systems of intelligence. And if you do that, you will never be real time. In terms of your ability to be able to leverage AI tools for real time analytics, and you're going to have a much more expensive environment than if you were to bring these two worlds together. That is the biggest blind spot. A second blind spot for people that are not that far along is that they may think that it's about using and or buying AI inference engines, either on-prem or in the cloud, when really it's about getting your data to turn your data into information so that it can be properly utilized. And that's a very simple argument, which is there's the old phrase garbage in, garbage out, and that is no more true than it is in AI. You put in poor data, you're going to get poor outputs. So really focus on having really strong and clean systems of record, and that's what we're going to help customers to do.
So, what I think I'm hearing you say, if I steal your analogy, is I don't need a more efficient fireplace. I need to move to a thermostat system.
Exactly right.
So, folks, look, that's the map, right? Pure and Everpure have been at the forefront of making storage more durable, making data set management a different operating model, an automation engine to essentially allow your organization to streamline the way in which you use and manage data through your enterprise. One Touch now brings context in, allowing us to fundamentally turn that, well managed and well operated storage into a data intelligence or AI ready data. And the operating model of this decade, as Charlie just said, is for us to bring the users of that data together into a single process and workflow and have everybody centered around the same goal, ultimately using that data to give an enterprise its strategic advantage versus everybody else out there. Charlie, thank you so much for your time. Folks, if you found this valuable, please subscribe to Beyond the IT Headlines. We're on YouTube and Spotify. Drop a comment with your biggest AI data challenge. We read everything. And lastly, don't forget to check out our newsletter at thedatawire.com for more analysis on data, infrastructure, and AI strategy. For Beyond the IT Headlines, I'm Shawn Rosemarin. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.